Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and I've got some more new cards to talk about here in part 3 of my Rastakhan's Rumble card review. Bwonsamdi the Dead, Spirit of the Dead, and we're catching up with Belligerent Gnome as well. If you don't have tons of time, you can hit the link in the description for my quick reviews. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and jump into some detailed thoughts and discussion on these 3 cards right now. So before we get to the shiny new legendary, it's important that I think we talk about Spirit of the Dead first, the new 1 mana Spirit for Priest. Of course, it has stealth for 1 turn. It's a 0/3, and the effect here reads, after a friendly minion dies, shuffle a 1-cost copy of it into your deck. And that's going to set up what Bwonsamdi the Zombie's all about. But just to come out and say it, I think this is a really strong card for a couple of different reasons. So first off, let's talk about the effect, sort of the primary intention for this card. It feels a bit like Sonya Shadow Dancer almost for Rogue, where if something is dying on board, you're getting a copy of it in return. But instead of adding, a 1 mana 1/1 copy to your hand like Sonya, this is instead adding the card to your deck, but it's retaining its stats. So if you trade in a Ysera, it becomes a 1 mana 4/12 Ysera in your deck. And then clearly, a 1 mana Ysera is an incredible play, and lots of minions become amazing when they're only 1 mana. So if you're able to kill certain specific things while Spirit of the Dead is on the board, you're going to be adding some great results into your deck, almost like you see with Academic Espionage, where sometimes there's those crazy 1 mana high rolls off of Espionage, but this is more predictable and controllable, and for that reason, I think far more consistent. Debatably worse than Sonya in some ways, but arguably better in others, but I think still a similar power level. And the reason that's even better is because this does have that stealth for 1 turn. It's often gonna be able to do that. It's gonna be able to make an impact. So for instance, you can play this alongside a bunch of minions all at once because it's so cheap at 1 mana. You can dump this with 3 or 4 things. Your opponent's going to feel compelled to kill those 3 or 4 things. You get them all added to your deck really cheap. Maybe it's just 1 or 2 high value things. Maybe it's just Ysera, but if they have to kill Ysera, then Spirit of the Dead's going to activate. It's going to give you that awesome Ysera return. And then beyond that, if this does live for a turn, if they don't address your minions, then you maybe get to trade in. If you have rush minions, you could force your hand even more, or charge minions, of course. So there are a lot of ways to make this thing work. So I don't think it's got a consistency challenge as you might expect. I think it is going to succeed a lot of the time, because that would really be the only thing holding this card back. And if it costs 3 or 4 or 5 mana, I think it'd be really hard to activate. But at only 1, you're just going to be able to just dump the thing anytime you want, and it's probably going to activate. Now, of course, it is susceptible to AoE effects. A Flame Strike's going to take it out very easily, but you're going to have to figure out the matchups and the situations, the contexts in which to play it. It's not something you just play out all the time. So I do think for its effect, for its true intention, it has a lot of potential. But I think there's this secret other potential for this card that has nothing to do with the effect. It's just a 1 mana 0/3 with stealth for Priest. And getting a 0/3 out early that won't die almost ever, that's a really big deal, because that means you can buff the crap out of it. You can power word shield this thing to your heart's content. You can give it inner fires. This is like the perfect buff setup minion. It's, like Northshire Cleric sometimes serves that purpose as a 3 health minion that you buff a bunch, or Radiant Elementals, or whatever it might be, but those are susceptible to death. Spirit of the Dead is going to be very hard to kill if you just play this out on turn 1. So although it has this neat synergy with Bwonsamdi and this cool value effect and, this long-term game plan of adding all these cheap minions to your deck, which is really cool and probably good, I think the more exciting and promising aspect is the fact that just a stealthed 0/3 for 1 mana for Priest creates all kind of opportunity with buff cards. And I like that almost more. So maybe this becomes the foundation for like a buff tempo Priest, or a buff aggro Priest, or just a buff combo Priest. And maybe the 1 cost thing is a nice bonus, but not really the design that you care about. It's really just the 0/3 with stealth. Before I jump off this card, there were a few other specific sort of synergies I wanted to talk about real quickly. First are things like Reckless Experimenter, where you can just guarantee your stuff dies and the Spirit of the Dead activates it instantly and just gives you a lot of additional resources. I also think there's some synergies potentially with Zarek's cloning gallery, where you just get that big board of 1/1s and you can maybe trade them in or Spirit Lash them and just reload a bunch of stuff. Alternatively, in the other direction, you can almost guarantee that the right things are going to be in your deck for when you play Zarek's Cloning Gallery. So like you could try to trade in your Velen, add the Velen back to your deck with Spirit of the Dead, and then Zarek's Cloning Gallery always has that Velen, or at least more consistently has that Velen. So there are even some sneaky ways to play this card in the decks that we understand today. All that said, just another reason I think this thing is a star card. It's going to be played somewhere or another. There's just too much upside, too many ways to play it. The effect is really cool and works for what Priest likes to do. So all around amazing card. So now let's move on to our buddy Bwonsamdi the Dead, the legendary Loa for Priest. He is a Loa, even though he's a humanoid, one of the few humanoid Loas, troll Loas. He is a 7 mana, 7/7, that beautiful Dr. Boom War Golem stat line. And he has a battle cry that reads, draw 1 cost minions from your deck until your hand is full. So obviously Bwonsamdi here intended to synergize with our previous card, the Spirit of the Dead, which I'll give you just a really brief reminder on. So Bwonsamdi, and just to clarify any doubts you might have, this does work together. This doesn't only draw cards that were originally 1 cost. This was displayed in the video that revealed these. If you take that Ysera and you put it in your deck at 1 cost, Bwonsamdi will draw her. He won't just draw Northshire Clerics. And this is really important for increasing the power output of Spirit of the Dead, because one of the challenges with a card like Spirit of the Dead is, okay, you added like 5 1-mana minions to your hand. That creates a lot of tempo opportunity if you can play them all out simultaneously. But to do that, you have to draw them. And you have to be able to play all that mana out at the same time. And that's a challenge that something like Espionage Rogue often has trouble with. It's like, okay, I draw all these 1-mana things, but sometimes just float like 5 or 6 mana anyway. So the fact that they were discounted wasn't that big of a deal. It's when you can play 4 or 5 of those heavily discounted cards simultaneously that allows you to make those big swing turns, those really impactful plays. Bwonsamdi would essentially enable that. If you can turn 4 or 5 minions into 1-mana cards, Bwonsamdi draws them all at once, you can just dump them because you got all of them alongside maybe a few other things as well. And that's why Bwonsamdi is important to sort of satisfying that condition that you set up with Spirit of the Dead. Bwonsamdi finishes it. And beyond that, because he's only 7 mana, if you do this late in the game, you can probably play Bwonsamdi alongside a few 1-mana cards instantly, right? You might get 3 1-mana minions you can play right away. You get a Ysera and whatever other crazy thing you created, maybe a few cheap minions, maybe just the Ysera is enough. And it becomes this really powerful, almost like spiteful summoner kind of turn where you get 2 huge targeted things on board and you just win the game off of the back of them, because he does have a solid stat line. He's not a sacrifice himself. You don't feel terrible playing a 7/7. Now, I think I'm not as excited about Bwonsamdi for the record because, you know, if you don't hit your Spirit of the Deads early, if you don't get that clutch turn, Bwonsamdi becomes a much weaker card. It's just a War Golem sometimes. It's not that exciting. So there is the risk that this thing whiffs or fails, and you have to build your deck around it a little bit more, perhaps, than you do with Spirit of the Dead. They clearly go together nicely, but Bwonsamdi doesn't work on his own nearly as well. So although I think this card does have quite a bit of potential to be a strong play in that environment, I wonder sometimes how easily that's going to be satisfied, and the problems you might run into when trying to get him to work, or just keeping him dead in your hand, for instance. I think it's also worth noting that there is a secondary way to play Bwonsamdi, not with your Spirit card, but in a deck that just runs 1 cost minions, even if it's just Northshire Clerics, right? Or maybe some test subjects or whatever it might be, whatever 1-mana thing you value. This could just be a reload card for a faster deck that you run at the end, you know, that style of Divine Favor where you just draw a bunch of stuff. But then I don't really think it's that impactful either. Often if you're in that sort of deck, you're looking to kill your opponent around turn 7, not reload with fairly low impact cards. So I don't think this ever feels great as just, you know, draw a couple Northshire Clerics for 7 mana. It's not a terrible play, but it's not the reason you'd run it in your deck, or you wouldn't certainly build a deck around that. So I don't think the utility there is really going to be what drives this. That's probably a fine backup plan, but not the reason Bwonsamdi would ever be exciting. Now, the question for me is, you know, is this whole plan where you get all these 1-drops and you add them to your hand and you play them really fast, this condition that the Spirit sets up, Bwonsamdi satisfies. Is that going to be enough to drive a deck? Is that going to be the thing that wins games? And I'm not really confident that it is. I think Spirit of the Dead is something you could include in decks always. I'm not sure Bwonsamdi is. I think that's a powerful play sometimes, but not better than other things Priest can necessarily do. And ultimately, if your opponent has a Twisting Nether or whatever random wide board removal, you just play into a Brawl and your whole deck set up this thing, and then Brawl just deals with it. Beyond that, if you really are trying to hit those like Ysera's and Obsidian statues and really high value 1-mana things with your Spirit, that's going to be happening very late in the game. At that point, you know, games are often already decided or trending towards a win or a loss. So it could feel more like a win more card, or maybe a card that doesn't, you know, help you stay alive. Like, would I just rather always play Psychic Scream? Maybe. And you can still play Psychic Scream, sure. But what I'm getting at is that how often is this going to be that impactful turn that changes the direction of the game or defines the deck style or the deck game plan? I don't know that it is, so I have some doubts. I think fundamentally it looks like it does good things, good stat line, positive effect, so clearly there's something to work with. I'm just not sure this is that, home run card that saves Priest or changes the game plan for Priest or the archetypes for Priest. It doesn't feel quite that strong to me. So finally, our last card here is the Belligerent Gnome, a 2-mana neutral minion. It's a 1/4. It has Taunt by default. It also has a nice little battle cry here. If your opponent has 2 or more minions, gain +1 attack. So this falls in that camp of, an early game defensive minion that might at first glance look like it's good at maybe stomping out aggro decks, particularly those that like to go wide on the board. So if you played this against a Zoo Warlock, for instance, that played like a Flame Imp and a Voodoo Doctor on turn 1, then your Belligerent Gnome would look like a fairly good answer. They'd have 2 minions, it would jump up to 2 attack, it would eat the Flame Imp and maybe another minion, and it would go 2 for 1, and you'd feel pretty good about that scenario. So clearly, at least a little bit of potential against those really early game wide board style decks. But at the end of the day, when I look at Belligerent Gnome, I see a card that just doesn't look that compelling to really run in most decks, and really probably isn't even that good of a tool against aggression either. And one reason for that is the consistency of its battle cry. There are going to be instances where you just need to play this thing and its battle cry doesn't go off. And then it just isn't trading very well. It's not establishing counter pressure. It's considerably worse than alternatives like Voidwalker or Tar Creeper. And although, yes, it falls in a gap between those two for mana cost, that's almost a problem more than a benefit, because just things like deny your hero power. It's not as cheap to play as Voidwalker for that sort of interruptory thing. And I know Voidwalker is a class card, not a neutral card, but for the sake of example and sort of archetypal views on these cards, a 1-mana 1/3 taunt is much more flexible to play. It can still interrupt without costing mana. Think about like Righteous Protector. It has the same sort of thing. Belligerent Gnome doesn't feel as good there. It's also just not as meaty as something like Tar Creeper, which takes better trades into mid-game boards, has more total health. So it's a bit of a tweener there, where it's just not as good as other options to fill in either of those roles. And then beyond that, for Belligerent Gnome, the other thing that comes to mind is when I compare this to cards that are more, easily comparable, like Vulgar Homunculus, for instance, for Warlock, or perhaps even, Armor Smith for Warrior. It's a 2-mana 1/4, and I think Armor Smith, for instance, has way more defensive potential. And I think Vulgar Homunculus is a card that's more consistent than Belligerent Gnome. And in fact, the 2 health damage on that one is often a good thing, not a bad thing. So compared to Belligerent Gnome, compared to Vulgar Homunculus, Belligerent Gnome looks a lot worse to me. It has many more weaknesses. The downside is bigger because sometimes that attack value does matter. There's not the upside of self-damage that sometimes Warlock benefits from. And then I think about Vulgar Homunculus, and it's not like this mind-blowingly good card, right? It's not like, oh, Vulgar Homunculus is the best card in the game. It's solid, it's fine. And Belligerent Gnome's a little bit below that in my mind. So I don't see this card having a ton of promise. It's solid. It's fine. It'll be a okay arena card, but I'm not sure what constructed decks want to utilize this thing. Now, to shift gears completely, I do think there's a chance this could get played in more aggressive token style decks, so not as a defensive tool. Every comment up to now has been referencing its defensive potential. I think it has slightly more potential as an offensive token style minion, where you play it down to maybe protect your early board. And the fact that it's a 1 attack doesn't matter as much because you're buffing it, you're Fungal Mancering it, you're Power of the Wilding it, whatever buff tool it might be. It just serves as that body that sort of interrupts and gets in the way. We've seen that in the past with cards like Crypt Lord, for instance, or Voidwalkers do that in Zoo sometimes. These little just disruptive bodies that protect your other assets. Tar Creeper has served that purpose too. Things that look defensive at first glance, but then become offensive arsenal kind of cards. Even then, I'm still not sure Belligerent Gnome's amazing at that, but it might be that tool for some class that has a gap. That will probably only happen once Prince Keleseth rotates out. So a card that I suspect won't see hardly any play at all initially in Rastakhan's Rumble, but perhaps with the standard format rotation still has those fundamental attributes that make it okay in that environment. So that's why you're going to see the rating here reflect some of that raw potential, although it's going to take a while to fulfill that potential. So all that said, let's go ahead and jump into my quick reviews. Spirit of the Dead is a 5-star card. Bwonsamdi the Dead is a 4-star card. Belligerent Gnome is a 3-star card. And there you go, folks. That wraps it up for part 3 of my card review for Rastakhan's Rumble. Exciting to see another Loa. Kind of a surprise, but I think a promising new archetype on the horizon and a very fun set of cards to play with. So this was a good one. That said, if you guys have questions, thoughts, comments, revisions, fixes, ideas, all of that belongs in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.